Hello everyone, welcome back to Testimony and Reader. Today we'll continue our story, Angel Over Her Tent. The more Mrs. White spoke, the greater her reputation as an evangelist grew. It spread to Broken Hill, a silver mining town 450 miles northwest of Melbourne. Mrs. Robert, a Sabbath keeper, learned about the woman prophet and preacher and wanted to hear her speak. She spoke constantly to her friends and neighbors about Ellen G. White, until some of them knew almost as much about her as Mrs. Robert did. One day, Mrs. Robert mentioned to a neighbor woman that she planned to visit Melbourne and hear Mrs. White. The neighbor, who owned a local shop, had listened to Mrs. Robert talk so much about Mrs. White that she became skeptical that anyone could possibly have talents and abilities Mrs. Robert claimed she had. She particularly doubted that Mrs. White could hold the attention of a large audience for several hours and often express her belief on the matter to Mrs. White. As Mrs. Roberts described her planned trip, the woman suddenly remarked, "You know, I have always wanted to take a holiday to Melbourne. If you don't mind, I'll go with you." "What about your shop?" the Adventist asked in surprise. "I'll arrange for someone to run it." The journey to Melbourne was long. No direct rail connection existed between Broken Hill and the larger city. They had to follow a longer route that swung west, then south. In Melbourne, they learned that Mrs. White was scheduled to speak in one of the city's larger halls. In a carriage, they arrived at the hall and found it crowded. When Mrs. White walked on the platform, the neighbor noticed her small size. "That's the woman you are always talking about?" she whispered to Mrs. Robert. "That's the little woman." When Mrs. White walked on the platform, the neighbor after the introduction and parliamentaries, Mrs. White rose to speak. Momentarily, she stood looking around at the audience, something she usually did before each sermon or lecture. Occasionally, her gaze rested on a particular person. Nervously, the woman whispered to Mrs. Robert, "I am afraid." "Afraid of what?" her friend asked. "That woman is looking straight at me. I am sure of it. She knows all about me." Mrs. White began her sermon, her voice, which some said remind them of the clear tones of a bell, reached each person in the large crowd. The people sat attentively throughout the long meeting. The neighbor seemed as interested in it as everybody else. At its close, as the people filed out of the hall, she turned to Mrs. Robert and said, "I must send a telegram to Broken Hill immediately." What your hurry?" "I want to notify those at home to close my shop on Sabbath." Besides speaking to large groups, Mrs. White also did personal evangelism. Near her home in Carabang, near South Wales, which she called Sunnyside, lived a family who owned a large fruit farm. She had a great interest in the family. The father raised excellent oranges and lemons, an avid reader. He had learned much about Adventist doctrines, but he never fully accepted them. Although he knew better, he clung to many of his old habits. Mrs. White felt disappointment that the farmer and his family did not join the church. In a vision one night, an angel stood by her bed and directed her to visit the citrus grower with copies of her books. The books, the angel said, would help convert him to obeying the instruction. The next day, she collected a few of her longer books and placing them on the buggy seat beside her, drove over to the fruit farm. Although the man was working out in the orchards, he came up to the house when he learned that she had stopped by. In a few minutes, Mrs. White turned the conversation to religion. Speaking to him as she would to a Seventh-day Adventist member, she said, "You have responsibilities. Here are your neighbors all around you." She mentioned to the distant farmer with her hands, "You are accountable for every one of them because you have biblical knowledge they don't have. If you love what you know and follow it, you will help convert many to Christ." He looked at her strangely. His expression seemed to be turning, trying to tell her that he had long ago given up these points of Adventist belief that he had accepted. But Mrs. White knew it already. Ignore his expression. She continued to talk to him as if he were an Adventist. We are going to help you to begin to convert your neighbors. She balanced the books on her lap. I want to give you a present of some books you can use. The farmer politely tried to refuse them. We have a local library for which to get books. He protested, trying to think of a way to change the subject. She looked around the room. I don't see any here. Apparently you have returned all those you have borrowed. Perhaps you don't like to go to bother or taking out books from the public library. Librarians then had much stricter rules about who could take books and how they could do it. I have brought some books for you and your children to read. By ignoring his protest, she silenced them, and he finally accepted the books. Before she left, Mrs. White knelt and prayed with him. When they stood again, the tears rolled down his leathery cheeks. I am glad you came to see me. I thank you for the books, he repeated over and over. The next time she visited the fruit farm, the man told her that he had read part of Prophets and Kings. There is not one syllable I could change. He commended every paragraph speaks right to the soul. Which book do you consider the most important? She asked. I lend them all to my neighbors, and the hotel keeper thinks the great controversy is the best. Suddenly, his lip began to quiver. But I think Prophets, Patriots and Prophets is the best. It is the one that has pulled me out of the mire. Mrs. White understood human nature. She knew that a person becomes much interested in those things he is actively involved in. Getting the farmer to work for his neighbor by lending them books made him interested in Adventism again. Reading Mrs. White's books also touched his heart. He and his family joined the church, and together they helped bring in several neighboring families. Mrs. White's influence on one man had far-reaching results.